Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And continuing on with my reviews of the books from the 2025 Booker Prize longlist, I wanted to talk about this next book, Benjamin Markovits with The Rest of Our Lives. And I'll go into some spoilers at some point, but for the most part, I'm going to try and keep this spoiler free. But yeah, let's get talking a little bit about this book. So, to the novel itself. I have mixed feelings about this book, and the tricky thing I find with this is once a book is longlisted or nominated for a prize or something like that, it tends to it tends to change how you appraise that novel. And so for me, I sometimes find it quite tricky with books where I'm maybe expecting more than the book has, because I'm looking at it through the prize lens of this is one of the 13 books, for example, chosen from written in English this year. And so part of me in that thinks then, okay, I'm looking for something quite specific. I'm looking for something game-changing or new or dynamic or whatever. And I found this book a bit mixed. And I don't know how fair that is, but I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts on the book. So the overall concept of the book is that Tom, our protagonist, wakes up one day, his youngest kid turns 18, and this invokes a promise that he'd made to himself, which is that 12 years ago, when his wife cheated on him, he would stay together for the kids until they were 18, until the last of them was 18, and he was able to leave. And so he decides that he's going to do this. He doesn't really make a great deal of fanfare about it. He sort of leaves and keeps on pretending that he's going to do something else. Oh, I'm going to visit my brother, I'm going to visit this person. And in doing so, just kind of continues on. And this sort of coincides as well with some of his health things, where he is, I think in his mid-50s, I want to say, and he has various health complications, where he keeps on waking up looking really, looking and feeling pretty rough. And everybody around him is talking about this. And he sort of says, oh, yes, I'll get this checked up. And he then embarks on this mini journey, driving for quite a while, not fully knowing where he's going. And in doing so, it becomes a sort of road trip novel that also is meant to capture the zeitgeist of where the US is at the moment. And so there are references to him seeing or overhearing things, and getting a sense essentially of what is happening in the country. All of that, I think, by itself is relatively interesting, and I enjoyed the parts where he does that. There are quite a few parts of this book that I think are quite funny, and where there's something about him as the sort of clueless figure who is just observing and watching things and doesn't understand how the country has changed around him, potentially. All of those things I think are quite interesting, and particularly that idea of 12 years as well, of what has happened in the 12 years since that moment. And the dogs are all going off. One moment. Okay, we've all had our barks now. That's good. So he is on this sort of road trip, and people are worried about him because of his health things, and he seemingly is both worried about it himself and also is trying to brush this under the carpet. But he continues on this journey, and in doing so, it kind of just builds pace until you realise you're quite close to the end of the book. And it's a relatively short novel, so you get to kind of quite near the end of the book. And I think this was my challenge then, was I didn't feel like much had necessarily happened. And it doesn't have to be. A book doesn't have to be full of plot to make something happen. Sea Scraper being a fantastic example, where only really a few things happened, but I thought the novel was wonderful. The thing I find challenging with this book is I don't know what the point of that was. That I get that this is trying to give a perspective of America at the moment, but I don't think it ever goes deep enough into any of those moments. I don't think we get a real sense of what's happening in the US. He really drives between a couple of states, and even then he sort of thinks a bit about basketball and wants to write a book about basketball, and that's been a long-term dream. And then he sees a couple of other people. There's not a great deal of the historical part, or the kind of the wide breadth of the US that I think the novel seems to be hinting at the beginning. We also don't seem to have a great deal, in my mind at least, of character development through this. He seems to have some thoughts about things, and I'll come on to the ending later in the spoilers, but I don't think that there's a great deal of change there either. And so part of me is left wondering to some degree what the novel is trying to do or trying to be. And again, the novel doesn't have to be anything. The novel could just be telling a story. But this is a story that seems so set up to deliver a specific kind of narrative or a specific kind of conversation. And that's where I think the novel fell flat for me, because I don't get where we're going with this, and I don't think the novel ever really matches up to where it seems to say that it's going. So the novel takes us across this route and this journey, and ultimately, what do we learn from the end of this journey? Do we just return where we are at the beginning? So that's kind of where I fell with this novel. And again, maybe it's unfair to expect the novel to have to do this. It is just telling the story of Tom, who is wrangling with some things at the end of his relationship. And I think the book is very fun and serviceable in doing that. I think it has really fun turns of phrase at times. He is an interesting character in parts for some of his internal thoughts, even if he's a bit of a, he's meant to be sort of a slightly crotchety old man at times, and having his kids' insights are often more interesting. But that's something that I felt was then underdeveloped. I thought that this was maybe going to give slightly more there, and so that's where I'm at with this novel, and a little confused. And again, part of me wonders if it's just because I'm looking at it through the lens of a book that has been longlisted for the Booker Prize. Actually, if I was just reading this novel devoid of any of that, would I have just thought this is quite a fun road trip novel? But then it makes me think, because something like All Fours by Miranda July or A Spot of Bother by Mark Haddon, I feel take the themes of that type of book and do something much more interesting with it. In All Fours, although I know a lot of people hated that book, I think Miranda July creates a character who is so off the wall and funny, and it looks more specifically at a kind of women being done with emotional labour. And I think something like A Spot of Bother by Mark Haddon looks at shame and health problems and so many other things in a really interesting light as well. And so this novel, I felt, just sort of landed quite strangely for me, where I don't really know where we were going with it. I still enjoyed it. That's the tricky thing. I enjoyed the ride of this. This was not a book I didn't enjoy reading. I just felt like it was teeing me up to read something more dramatic or more with more kind of a direction, and it kind of just felt like it ended, and then I was sort of like, okay, cool, that's where we are. And with that in mind, I'm going to go on to talking about spoilers. I realise this sounds like I hate the book. I did not hate this. I think I just wanted more. So with that in mind, let's talk about the spoilers, because I want to talk a bit about the end, where I think some parts of this novel come together really interestingly and others sort of feel a bit different. So yeah, if you need to drop off now, absolutely fine. Take care. But yes, I'm going to go on to talk a bit about some spoilers. So with the spoiler curtain now in effect, I don't know why I keep calling it a spoiler curtain, but the end part of the book. So after all of this journey, all of this moment of sort of bumbling through life and thinking a bit about how everything feels like it's changed from around him, he comes to comes back home. He and his wife, Amy, have a bit more of a conversation. He spent most of the novel very much just holding things in and not really saying much. He, even with things like his health problems, he's been very secretive about that. And so the end of the novel is kind of a coming together of the family coming back and sort of trying to address this, that, there he is in, particularly in hospital and dealing with some of his health things. And people around him kind of saying, well, what next? Where do we go from here? And his response sort of being to kind of continue on as he had before, but with a new idea and a new lens of maybe not holding on to some of the sort of tension he had for other parts of the book. And in some ways I found that quite interesting. In some ways I don't think there was any other way for him to go. I think the novel had all directed us towards this idea that he couldn't really strike it out alone, and he'd been trying to, and his road trip was a sign that actually he needed community, he needed people around him, he needed family. And everybody around him is worried about him and has been slowly worrying about how that's happened. And I think there is something in this about also how that sense of loneliness, and particularly when it intersects with things like health problems, can be a reason why many people feel that they start shifting towards other politics or other views, for example, because they are themselves discontent with their lives, and that level of discontent is something that is instead of looking inwards and really thinking about this, they project that outwards. They maybe turn to more reactionary politics or something like that as a way of dealing with that. That's a way of projecting that fear over there and not thinking about it. And I think the book does start to go into some of that in some interesting ways by some of the things he says as he's traveling. The idea that he might become slightly more racist or sexist or whatever because of the things he's feeling. But I think the book then sort of stops there. It doesn't really develop that. That's the sort of feeling I got, that although it maybe lands that final blow subtly, I needed a little bit more to that, I think, personally. I think I wanted the book to actually to really deal with the macro of the world. We're dealing very much with his inner life, and it feels almost alien that we're watching a sort of slow decline of the US around him, in terms of sort of economic pressures, in terms of whatever else in the things that he's seeing. But we're not really engaging with the bigger narrative of that. We're only still lost in his world where he can't quite get over his wife's affair. And so instead, I feel like the novel sort of holds us at an arm's length from those discussions. And I get a lot of that is probably inferred. Some part of that is we need to be doing that thinking ourselves rather than necessarily having to hear it through the mouths of the character. I get that. I think it just felt almost that there was a timelessness to this in almost the wrong way. This book feels so set in a specific time, and yet I didn't get a sense that that world of what's happening in that time was happening around this character or in this world. Again, maybe that's the point, that he is so obsessed with his own interiority, he's so in his own head that he is not really noticing the world around him. But yeah, that's kind of where I landed. And so it's an odd thing again, because I enjoyed reading the book. I just don't quite know what we're meant to take from this. And in some ways, that's what I found the most troubling. I don't feel like I had a reaction to this book that felt like I could really run with it and be excited about the ideas of this book, because in many ways I felt like I'd seen those ideas played out more interestingly elsewhere, which is not the fault of this book, but that's kind of where I landed. And oddly, I mean, that's the thing, I really enjoyed his book, You Don't Have to Live Like This, I think it's called. I thought that was really fun, even though actually in many ways it's dealing with social issues, it's dealing with a slightly withdrawn or remote character. All of that I think I found more interesting, whereas this book felt in some ways like it traded some of those parts in and didn't necessarily deliver the final thing. It's still enjoyable and still funny. I just find it strange that, I don't know, there are other books I maybe would have had on this list. This all feels very harsh. I don't think it's a bad book. And again, maybe I'm looking at it through the lens of a prize rather than taking the book at its face value. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts anyway on this book, because I think it's, I'd be keen, just in case there's something really huge that I've missed in this book, which I may well have done. I'm by no means claiming that I've got the definitive read on this book. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.